Hey, Ryan, good morning. Thank you so much for joining me.
Brian, thanks for having me on. It's great to meet the guy I'm always mistaken for. The Ryan
E-
Brian connection is real.
Exactly. Yeah, no, this is as close as I want to get to interviewing myself. It's good to be with you. So we have a similar backstory, I think, in terms of how we're feeling about this general political realignment that's going on. Um, you went to law school, I went to law school, and then we emerged, and suddenly we began reevaluating our feelings about the left and the Democratic Party. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. If you will indulge me in the background, I would say, a really good Democrat, meaning that I graduated from undergrad. I went to teach for America. I did 7 years teaching, and I did that for, I would say, what today would be expressly called social justice reasons. Back then, the language was different. But the idea was that you want to do something about, historic injustices in the country, and education seemed like the silver bullet. So I taught for 7 years, went to law school. While I was in law school, Trump ascended, and I was, 2013 I was when I went to law school. So by the time I was
Mm,
exiting law school, that was his election, and I was vehemently opposed to him and voted for Biden, as you know, for the same reason that for that same reason, I really didn't want Trump to get a second term. And my heckles went up during that election cycle because in law school I'd been exposed to some different ideas. I'm what I would call a reluctant originalist and a reluctant federalist.
mhm,
Like it's not my
mm.
it's not my default political leaning, but when I was exposed to the ideas, they made more sense to me than the alternatives. So
Yes,
that was a change of
right.
pace. And then during Biden's election, I just started getting the sneaking suspicion that the coalition that formed to elect Biden and defeat Trump had nothing to do with the Democratic Party that I had known.
Mm,
And I started examining it more closely. And the more I looked into it, the less satisfied I was. And by the time Biden's term was over, I was no longer a Democrat and registered as an independent because it didn't no longer align with anything that resembled my values. And
right.
that was a very difficult transition. So I imagine from what I've seen for you, you have a somewhat similar story where there was kind of a get
Yeah.
exposed to some ideas, reevaluate, moment of truth.
Yes. Yes. Exposure to the ideas, and then what is going on with the Democratic Party with Biden. Not saying some good things didn't happen and everything is black and white, but there was a lot of reasons to between the culture wars and the outcomes in foreign policy. You can talk about inflation. There are a lot of especially because not only getting exposed to new ideas, but then starting a podcast and interviewing a lot of libertarians exposed to their economic ideas, you start to put it all together and you say, why would I be a Democrat at this point? I never liked this identity politics stuff. Um, and so critical race theory was very big at the time. And we'll certainly get into that, I think. But for me, it was, yeah, coming from the left generally, and then just the basic education of law school, studying torts, contracts, constitutional law, all these classes where you learn about the primacy of the individual and how important it is to be responsible as a citizen because these structures are built around you. And that's what it's about, individuality and legality and egalitarianism. And um, I heard you say in your interview with Destiny that studying con law is like the history of racism in America. I agree with that. It was, it's tragic in some ways. You definitely get an up close view, and so there's a lot to talk about there. But this basic education had the effect of nudging me to the right, um, and then getting exposed to in con law, a bit of jurisprudence, and how Supreme Court justices analyze the law and different ways you can do it. Originalism being one of them, and all these different thoughts, and saying, yeah, no, that makes sense. Maybe you can't use it in every situation, and so you got to be dynamic, but no, that makes sense to freeze the provision in time and say, hey, no, let's not interpret it through a modern lens. And let's not empower these 9 people with black robes to make laws essentially through their interpretations. Let's have them be their basic function, their default function be to that makes sense to interpret it as it was written and as understood by the public at that time. So that was all building up. But then I studied critical race theory in 2 electives in my final year, being my father's son, coming from that background of wanting to be interested in social justice and exploring it. Man, it was controversial. I mean, the material was controversial. The attitudes of the classmates were controversial. And in fact, One of the two courses I took was a jurisprudence, but CRT flavored. So that was a mind F to kind of invert that, or not invert, maybe that's too harsh, but to take the study of how those justices are supposed to interpret the Constitution in a critical race theory directive was so counter to what had been building up. And so it was just an absolute shock. So that's where I landed.
I think there's a real. I think now the public has caught up with this, and it took some real yeoman effort by a lot of public figures, and it took, I mean, basically the culture wars. But what people have realized is that there's a vast distinction between activist disciplines and truth-seeking disciplines. And people will call originalism the boogie monster, and Justice Scalia. It seems like they're because it does have political ramifications, which I don't think can be shied away from. But at its core, originalism is not an activist discipline. It's seeking to understand what the original meaning of a constitutional provision was, how it was publicly understood at the time it was enacted. And that's what the law is. It's asking judges to be lawyers, to do legal reasoning and figure out what the law says. And when you compare it to critical race theory, I think that really shows the difficulty we have with a doctrine like that in a place like a law school, because it's an expressly activist doctrine. It's not asking what the law is, it's asking what the law ought to be. Yes. And when you ask judges what the law ought to be, you are asking them to overreach and step into the territory that is rightly reserved for the legislative branch primarily and to the executive branch secondarily. But judges shouldn't be doing that. That's not what they're there for. And unfortunately, if we ask our judges to do that, we're asking them to overstep. And that creates a simmering constitutional crisis. And we're kind of seeing that play out now, where we've had years and years and years of executive overreach and judicial overreach. The judicial overreach is now being corrected because we have a primarily originalist court, and they're paring it back a little bit. But until we bring the branches back into balance, there's going to be tensions because, quite frankly, over my life, the executive branch has wildly exceeded the boundaries of its power, and which I'm sure we can get into. And the court made a lot of non-originalist rulings where they were hugely expanding the number of rights that Americans had that have nothing to do with the text of the Constitution. And while it's easy to applaud that, you say, oh my God, we got a new right. Yay, we feel so wonderful about that. The other way of looking at it is that when the court says that you have a new right, what they're saying is this is an issue that people are not allowed to vote on. This is an issue that is removed from the democratic process. And you have to ask why 9 justices are empowered to remove something from the democratic process unless the Constitution says they're allowed to. And it's a scary thing to say, because once you start down that road, it's very hard to reverse course. And we've seen how politically difficult that is and how upset it makes people. So it would be better, I think, if the justices just kind of stayed in their lane and limited themselves to interpreting the Constitution as it is rather than as they think it ought to be.
Yep. My very first guest, the second episode I did of this podcast 4 years ago now, which was in my final year of law school, was this amazing student. I was just getting by, but I interviewed this guy. He's probably going to be a Supreme Court justice one day. He's probably a judge somewhere in DC right now. He was a very impressive guy, and he did my show, and it was amazing. And that's the argument that I became attuned to, is everyone has their roles in the Constitution. We shouldn't have these justices being activists. I mean, yes, at times you might have to depart from originalism, but that's different than saying, go ahead and be an activist and go ahead and change the law. It's just not the way it should be done. There's a structural argument there, and that makes a lot of sense to me. And I understand the progressives will want to say, well, look, you got to get it done by any means necessary. People are suffering X, Y, and Z. That's the argument. And, change, let's go, let's make it happen. Okay. But you got to say, wait a minute, forgetting for a second what the substance of the argument is there a reason just structurally why this is wrong? And that's what going to law school, starts making you think about.
Well, that's the danger of judicial activism in the long run. Is okay. Let's say both sides fully adopt this, and we say we want our judges to do what we think is moral and good, with no real regard for what the Constitution says. We
Right.
just, if you think it's a right, it's a right.
Hmm.
If you think it's noble and good, okay, it's in the Constitution. Who cares?
Hmm.
Inevitably, 10, 20, 30 years down the road, you've eroded faith in the rule of law. Because how does that play out? You have
Hmm.
a liberal court. They're going to say, all right, well, the Constitution doesn't say you have a right to abortion, and certainly no one who enacted it thought there was at that time. But okay, we're going to apply it. And then the conservatives get a majority, and it's gone. Then the liberals get a majority, it's back. The conservatives get a majority, it's gone. And what happens is eventually people start to realize, like, wait a minute, these people aren't in doing law at all. There is no law. It's just an opinion contest. And
Hmm.
people would rightly assume that this is bullshit. This is not actually legal analysis. So I think we have to have judges who are constrained and are actually limiting themselves to legal analysis of the documents in front of them. And if they're not doing that, if they're asking what we ought to have and what's noble and good and wonderful, then they're acting like the legislature. And we have a legislature. We might be frustrated with our legislature, or we might wish it was faster or more efficient. But you can't let the judges be the legislature. Otherwise, they just usurp the power from all the other branches. And if your viewers haven't read it, one of the most wonderful pieces of legal writing on this topic is Scalia's dissent in Obergefell. And if you'll indulge me in the story, I was in law school. I was in Paris, actually, when Obergefell came out. Maybe it was slightly post law school. I can't quite remember. But I was so proud because I have a lot of gay friends. I have a lot of friends who couldn't get married because it was illegal. And I remember sitting there in Paris being like, oh God, I'm an American lawyer, and American lawyers just won this amazing right. And I feel so proud of my profession for having righted this historic wrong and doing this noble thing.
Right.
And then I read the opinion, and it was just bereft of legal reasoning. There was no reason in the main opinion that this right suddenly appeared. It was noble and good and courageous and wonderful. So it should be a right, because we think an evolving society would have this right. And then you read Scalia's dissent, which is remarkable. And in the first couple of pages, he says, this is a social policy. It's not one that concerns me much. There are social policies that have good and bad ramifications. This one might have them, but that's not my concern. My concern is who rules me. And today, the answer is 9 unelected lawyers from remarkably similar backgrounds who don't represent the country in any meaningful way, who have decided that a right that no one thought was inherent in the Constitution when it was enacted is suddenly beyond the democratic process. It must exist, and the people are not allowed to vote for whether or not they think it should. We, the court, are saying it must exist, and we're going to cram that down on everyone. And it was one of these remarkable watershed moments for me, because I favored the outcome. I thought it was in terms of, I'm czar of the universe. Okay, sure. But that's not the question the court should have. The court is not czar of the universe. They're not lord of the country. The question should be, does the Constitution say that this right exists? And if not, we have to reserve it to the people, because we, the court, should not be taking things out of the democratic process.
Yeah. Your point about eroding trust in the institution is well taken, because it seems like in terms of presidential politics, we've been ruled by executive order for so many years now, and you can see how we've really come to expect that, and it's really not been a good thing.
Oh, it's a disaster. I think this is, in some senses, Trump might be the medicine we need now, because I've been waiting my entire adult life for someone, and by someone I mean a major political party, to recognize the president has too much power. It's been expanding. I mean, I became politically active around 2000. I was at NYU during 9/11. So it was like, okay, oh my God, how are we going to solve this? But you look back on that era and you see Patriot Act, you see FISA courts, you see the massive expansion of executive power. You saw that play out in the Obama administration with drone strikes of American citizens. You saw that play out in the Trump first administration with the wall and with a number of other executive actions. And then I was hoping Biden would part back, but I was deeply disappointed because he went the opposite way and massively expanded executive power, or at least attempted to, in unheard of ways. The thinking about the OSHA COVID mandate, the attempt to, just write off $500 billion of student loan debt with the stroke of a pen, the attempt to create a sub-agency to patrol misinformation on the internet. Like, these were wild attempts to expand executive authority. And we need to figure out that this is too much. Like, the Congress needs to take some of this power back. And maybe, as President Trump has taken an expansive view of executive authority, if people realize, okay, the president really is in charge of these executive agencies, maybe the answer is we shouldn't delegate so much power to the executive branch. Maybe we need to remove some of this, because if the president is serious about putting his thumb on the scale, he really can. And that's, if you're going to give him this power, he'll wield it. If you don't like that, do something about it, because you're not always going to like the person in office. Sometimes it's your guy, sometimes just not.
Yeah, and that brings up another thing that, I never would have been aware of unless I had gone to law school, which is the delegation doctrine. It's interesting, and this concept that Congress has essentially delegated many of their law-making responsibilities to executive agencies, and so now it really, as you said, matters who the president is, and it's really not in line with what the framers envisioned, is it?
I don't think so. Now, I don't think that we are going to unring that bell and say you can't delegate. There's the major questions doctrine, and there's some stuff this Supreme Court is willing to put some limitations on it. But I do think you need to answer the question about what you envision the executive branch to be. And what I mean by that is, in the kind of conservative vision, and there's a lot of what are called unitary executive theorists on the current court, they believe that the executive should have not total, but near total control over the executive branch. He's the president with the executive power. So if you delegate something to the executive, you should expect the president is going to control it. The more liberal version of the court envisions Congress being able to delegate to the executive branch, but that the president might not be able to control what those agencies are doing. There might be, lifelong employees or non-political appointees who are just there forever and can kind of keep the ball rolling.
Deep state sounds deep statey.
It's one of those things that Trump said, and a lot of people scoffed at, and now we've realized actually is a very real thing. And you can't have it both ways, right? You can either have a sprawling executive branch with the president having limited authority, or you can have a smaller executive branch with the president having almost total authority. But if you have a sprawling executive branch where the president has total authority, you have a king. So these are incompatible visions of what the president's office is, and we need to pick. We need to decide. And if the Supreme Court says, and I think they will, and back President Trump up and say, no, you do have authority over these agencies, we, the people, should say, okay, so then maybe we need to roll back these agencies. Maybe we need to roll back this delegation, because if the president has total control over all of this, then too much has been delegated. And thankfully, you're starting to see this in the modern right, where they're trying to roll back things like USAID, roll back the Department of Education. There is a groundswell around the idea of shrinking the scope of the federal government, which I think is the only logical conclusion you could draw from the court deciding the president, as I think they will, has near total control over these agencies.
Let's talk about Trump. I don't think you voted for him. I think you mentioned that in your interview with Destiny, which I do want to talk to you about. I want to talk to you about how you got hooked up with Destiny. But I think for a minute at least, it seems interesting. Good for you. Big name.
Yeah.
Trump, I don't think you voted for him. You couldn't get over his actions related to his election loss. I somehow did. That was the big hurdle. When push came to shove, people go, Brian, how could you get over that? And I just said, between this option and this option, and in totality, I give him a pass. Ugh, wrong of me?
I couldn't do it. Now I've spoken to a few people who I think are like good and reasonable people, like Lactoid's a lawyer who does streaming, and Rob Noor, for example, is a political commentator, and they both were able to get over this. My approach to this is that I'm not particularly partisan. Like, I'm not really interested in saying which side is better, which side is worse. What I'm most interested in is trying to advocate for what I think American society is based on, which is constitutional principles that apply neutrally. For me, the idea that the vice president gets to decide whether he's certifying the election is unworkable. It's an unworkable norm. Because if you imagine, like, even in this cycle, if JD Vance, who might be running for president at that time, gets to decide whether or not he wins the election, that can't work. It can't be the norm. So I can't advocate for something that I think, if I gave that power to my political opponents, I would be uncomfortable with. It can't be rule for thee, not for me. It has to be a neutral rule. But I'm sensitive to the argument that I've heard people make where they're saying, like, given the choices, I felt like I had to make a compromise one way or the other. I've heard it. I'm sympathetic to it. I couldn't quite cross that threshold myself.
Right.
But I'm not mad he won. Let's put it that way. Like I certainly ruled out Harris before I ruled out Trump. And I was, in the last weeks of the campaign, kind of desperately trying to figure out if that was something that I could in some way move past, and just ultimately I couldn't.
Right. No, I understand and I respect that. It was such a crazy time, and that was so crazy. January 6th, and not to say that he incited violence. I don't think you would say that he did, but in
I'm not
totality,
even really. I mean, the storming of the Capitol is, like, objectively a bad thing. Like, it's a very bad thing, but it's not the thing that was dispositive for me. Really, it was the constitutional question where he asked Pence to certify a slate of electors he knew was not the slate of electors the states had sent. And if you imagine that scenario as the rule, like, let's say every president and every vice president gets to do that, it would be the end of the system. Like, it's a uncrossable line in terms of norms. So that was that. I just couldn't square it up. The closest I came was when he did Rogan. In the third hour, he offhand said, "If I win, this is my last election," and I believed him. I thought he was heartfelt, and that ruled out him seeking a third term, which would be unconstitutional. But he might find a way to try to finagle that, or and hopefully ruled out him putting his thumb on the scale for his successor. But it wasn't quite enough for me, in part because one of his qualities that's got him very far is that he's very tough to read. Like, even when I think I know what he's thinking, I'm wrong more often than I'm right. So it's hard for me to make a decision based on me getting a read on his heart of hearts, because I think he's a better poker player than me. I think that I'm unlikely to know what he's thinking at any given time.
What did you think of his first term before shit went sideways?
It's tricky because there was so much noise, and at the time the noise really swayed me against him. There was a lot of publicity about how bad he was and some terrible things. And I don't think he was an effective governor in his first term. I mean, I don't think he knew how the government worked. I don't think he knew how to get what he wanted done. It seemed like he was flailing around. And I think that's, even in his own statements, I think something he wouldn't phrase it that way, but he's more or less admitted that there was a lot of problems in getting stuff done in the first term. I liked his judges. I think that the appointments he made, particularly Justice Barrett, has been a remarkable jurist, really good. If you're, I don't know if your listeners are the kind of people who listen to oral argument or read Supreme Court decisions closely, but she's been phenomenal. I mean, even when I was talking to Destiny, one of the points we agreed on is that Justice Barrett has been phenomenal, and
Mm-hmm.
he hates a lot of her decisions,
Right.
but she's just been a really remarkable jurist. And I think that part of his legacy was outstanding. And then, it was a little bit tough to judge him beyond that because COVID happened. So he had these tax cuts, which I benefited from tremendously. So I'm not going to, shit talk them now because they saved me so much money. But then when you have an emergency on top of tax cuts, you end up blowing up the deficit in a way that's almost unprecedented. And I'm a bit of a deficit hawk. So, the deficit is one of my number one issues. So from that perspective, it was not a real success. There's a bit of an asterisk because COVID was such a unique event.
Right.
But it's tough for me to give it, a really great grade on long-term economic stability, given that our deficit got, I think, what was it, 10 trillion or something on that magnitude increased during his term. And this is an awful mess for our kids. And I'm a father. So, getting this straightened out so that our kids aren't burdened by this debt going forward has got to be a top priority in my mind.
You can understand why he would be so pissed. Such a competitive guy. He's Donald Trump, and he's the president, and he's doing a fine job, and certainly in his mind. And then COVID hits. You can understand how that just cratered his everything. I mean, it was crazy, and it was very serious.
It was brutal. And if you want to give him the rose-colored glasses approach, what you'd say is, when you cut taxes, you're hoping that the economy grows such that the government still gets as much or more revenue because of economic growth, even though the taxes are lower. But then if you get a disaster like COVID that craters the economy, now you have cut taxes and you have economic decline, which is the absolute nightmare scenario.
Right.
Obviously, he had no idea COVID was coming when he cut taxes. So that you can't, it's not fair to attribute that to him. But at the same time, just on pure outcome, it didn't work out well. So that's which is tough. And I think that he's very motivated to make his legacy different in the second term. We'll see how that plays out because current economic measures are not great, but it's early. So we'll see. He hasn't really had time. He hasn't had time to reveal his long-term vision. We'll see how that plays out.
All right. So with that said, what is your take on his first 2 months in office?
So far, it's a tough one. It's a really mixed bag. I am really thankful that he has taken a sledgehammer to identitarianism. I'm a little concerned that the pendulum's going to swing so far the other way that you're going to end up with a wave of Democrats elected at some point. But I think that we had gotten to the point where we were building, I'm going to say CRT, but it's not really CRT. It's really identitarianism into our groupthink and into our institutions. And you were starting to see some really shocking things. Like during COVID, I remember in New York, where I was at the time, there was the state of New York was using race as a metric for prioritization of medicine, which is openly racist. Like it's not subtle. Like that's clearly too far. And we were, giving out grants on the basis of race, giving out, admission to college on the basis of race. And even when the Harvard case happened, and the question was, which I really find chilling, like, is it okay for Harvard to say that there are too many Asians in Harvard and discriminate against Asians in favor of other races in the name of diversity? And the Biden administration sent lawyers to defend the case, which you don't have to do that. You could have let that one go, but that was the position. They were attempting to bring expressly racial equity into everything they do. And that was the exact language used by the administration. And that is a disaster. It's an unconstitutional, un-American disaster. And the fact that that's been scrapped is wonderful. So that's a big thumbs up there. I'm not a tariff guy. So, honestly, I don't think anyone who really studies the economics is a tariff guy. Like they
Right.
are they are net negative. I don't know any argument to the contrary. What they can do is disrupt things. What they can do is protect specific industries. They can give you leverage in negotiations. And I almost liken it to a magic trick. Like when
Mm.
I used to do a card trick, and the pattern was I would talk about what a bad job I was doing. Oh, I'm screwing this up. Oh, I'll try one more time. That's the whole game, is I was screwing it up, right? And at the end, you do the big reveal, and now you're a genius because you were distracting people and talking yourself down. I think President Trump is putting himself in the same position. Like we all know tariffs are in the abstract negatives. So if he uses them to pull off some amazing outcome, now he's a genius. But if you impose them and you never get the big win, you're going to look foolish because you put yourself in a position where you have to have a big win. You have to have a big reveal to
Right.
look like a genius. And I think he's unfortunately digging himself in a bit of a hole that
Right.
way. Like I can't. I can understand tariffing Mexico for leverage about border issues. I could understand tariffing China to develop leverage because China has all kinds of unethical policies and trade. So there might be some leverage that you could get there. Certainly, they don't let our businesses into their country. Tariffing Canada is mysterious to me. I still haven't come up with a good reason for that. So I don't
Right.
know what his end game is. I'm hopeful it leads to something that's dramatically positive, but that one has been a bit of I would not call a great success so far. So
Right.
I think it's been a mixed bag. I'm certainly pleased that they're going after waste and fraud and budget. I wish it had been. I wish it had borne more tangible fruits up till now. Like for example, like
Mm.
when they just passed the continuing resolutions, like okay, like if you guys, if in your estimation, USAID needs to go, cut it. Don't fund it. If in your estimation there's all this waste that you found, hopefully the budget you pass will cut those things. Now it's only a CR, so they have till September. So maybe in September they'll cut it. They'll cut more stuff then. But in my experience, these things tend to get kicked down the road and not fixed. So I would have liked to have seen more legislatively imposed cuts on the budget in this cycle. But I'm hopeful that next one maybe we'll have more of that.
Right. So I know you're an independent in terms of how you're registered, but
Mhm.
are you more of a libertarian in terms of ideology? How do you identify, to
I
use a
don't
word that
know,
we
man.
both hate?
I'm politically homeless right now. I
Yeah.
think that what I really am is classically liberal, but classically liberal doesn't mean left leaning in the common parlance, right? Like classically liberal means that I'm interested in individual rights. I'm interested in constitutional values. I want to see
Yeah.
them preserved. And because of that, my approach to various issues has very little to do with the political parties. Like the great example right now is Mr. Khalil, the Columbia student
Yes.
who is they're attempting to deport. You know, I you see even like a legal personalities online kind of scrambling to align themselves on their party affiliation. Is this a good action or a bad action? And
Mm.
that's just not the question that interests me. The question that interests me is whether there's a free speech violation.
Hmm.
And if this strikes me as concerning from a free speech level, it's not decided. I don't think there's clear Supreme Court guidance on that case. So I'm not saying it is or it isn't yet. I think we don't know. But the way it was handled concerned me, and it concerned me. It would concern me whether, no matter who was president at the time, just like when the Biden administration attempted to create that sub agency to control internet disinformation, quote unquote disinformation, that really concerned me, and it would concern me no matter what party did it. So I guess the best way I can answer
Mm.
your question is like my vote is very much up for grabs. Whichever party
Hmm.
seems to be the one that is defending constitutional norms and values is going to get my vote. Um, yeah.
Yeah. And that's why it makes Trump so tricky. I mean, I always thought irony was the word to define
Mhm.
Trump's existence to begin with on the political stage. But I mean, to say that he had this gross violation of constitutional norms at the end of his first term, and then to say on the other hand that he's the better chance to uphold constitutional norms, it's just all fucking, excuse my language, but crazy. And it makes me think when you talk about the Khalil case in terms of how I'm developing. I have two reactions. You've maintained, and so I'm so grateful that you're with me today. I love how you've maintained the lawyerly approach, whereas I'm kind of seeping into this influencer reaction. Wait, what is the base going to think? And it's a very different posture. And I don't know. I better think twice before I get too far deep into it. Before next thing you know, I lose that part of my brain where I can do the objective analysis. So it's really sobering and helpful to have people like you on. And it just highlights, I think, the effect of the internet and the drama, the political drama. So you don't feel that ever swaying to you. It doesn't seem like it's getting to you.
I mean, you feel it, but I think you have to figure out what you want to do publicly, and then whether or not that's even possible. Because one gating principle is that if no one's watching you, it doesn't matter. And that's a challenge, because if you're not delivering hot takes and you're not kind of throwing red meat to the base,
good point.
It's actually very difficult to expand viewership. So I'm not minimizing that problem, because I certainly have not solved it. I have no large platform of my own, in part because I don't throw enough red meat. So I think that is a serious issue. And then another issue for lawyers, if you want to be taken seriously given legal analysis, is that the nature of our profession is that our opinions are for sale. Like, you can hire me and I will go to court and have your opinion. That is the nature of my job. So if I'm speaking publicly on just giving my own opinion, and I'm not speaking for a client, I'm not speaking for my firm, which is what I'm doing, I find it important that I attempt to be as fair as possible. And I'm a little painstaking if I can be, because I think lawyers have a credibility problem, because everyone knows you can pay us, right? So if I become too political, I lose the ability to say, as a legal expert, I think this is what the outcome should be, with that kind of credibility. Because when you watch a legal expert who's like a Fox News legal expert or an MSNBC legal expert, you know what their answer is going to be before they open their mouth, because they're going to find a way to say the home team is correct. And that is what lawyers do. We advocate. So once you become a pundit, your client is your political team. And your job is to go on the air and make the best argument you can for your political team. And that's fine. And that's what lawyers do. But at the same time, your view is no longer independent, and it should be treated the same way. Just like if I go into court and I say, Your Honor, in my opinion, my client is innocent, the judge rightly will say, no one cares about your opinion. Make an argument. We'll evaluate the argument, but everyone knows you think your client is innocent. Who cares? That's the opinion you are paid to hold. So I think that's tricky, and it's a tricky balance, trying to find ways to defend constitutional values, which is the thing lawyers are uniquely well positioned to do, without becoming so partisan that you lose the ability to do it. I don't think there's a solution. I think it's a tricky tightrope, and everyone seems to walk it differently.
Right on. So let me ask you about Destiny. For my audience who may or may not know, Destiny is a big online streamer, political analyst. Is that right?
Yeah, he does. He's a left-leaning political analyst, and he is a very smart guy, not a traditionally educated guy, but a very smart guy. And is also, I think, one of his most admirable traits. There are some that are less admirable, but one of his most admirable traits is that he spends a lot of time learning the details. And it's one of the things that makes conversations with him challenging, because he's paid literally at this point to go on stream and spend 9 hours researching a topic, having chat feed him the next website, the next case, and he'll just research something. So,
he gets paid to do the research.
He does live research. He does live research streams for 10 hours. So, in conversations with him are tricky, because if we're talking about law, I'm going to have a huge advantage in terms of knowledge and reasoning and ability to string cases together and explain things. When we get into politics, the advantage is totally shifts. He has much better knowledge of the details and who said what when and the dates and facts than I do,
Mm-hmm.
because he is literally paid to learn them 10 hours a day.
Mm-hmm.
And because he's a smart guy, that makes it a challenging conversation. You kind of got to go into it ready to maneuver. And then because he has such a massive audience, that's the other factor where, you can very easily become a meme if you're not careful.
Wow. No, you did a great job. How did you wind up landing that appearance?
So I wrote an article defending the immunity decision, which I put on X. And I spoke to an ex-associate of Destiny's. He's a lawyer who goes by Pisco on X. And he and I debated the immunity decision a few times on his stream and on a mutual acquaintance, Wick TV's stream. And those were, good conversations, sometimes heated, but productive. So then at the time, we can get into this, but Pisco's no longer associated with Destiny, but at the time they were. And Pisco had arranged a New York trip where Destiny was interviewing Democratic leadership. And so those conversations were getting a little glad handy. Like everyone was so happy to get the publicity and everyone's agreeing, and there was kind of a content dearth. So Pisco, and we went to the same law school, so we know of each other at least, reached out to me and said, wanted to have a little bit more of a confrontational, debatey conversation. So asked if I would come down to the studio to, do the immunity stuff with Destiny, which I was happy to do. The downside was 2 days after we recorded it, Destiny was immersed in a sex scandal. So
Right.
that was like a holy God, welcome to the internet moment where I'm thinking, okay, I got to talk about originalism.
Hey, everybody, guess what? I just did a great 2-hour video on Destiny. I killed it 2 days later. Now there's a video of him going around blowing a guy.
Well, this one was, this was even worse. He was accused by an ex-lover of releasing revenge porn. So I don't know the details. It's currently being litigated. There's a court case. So I don't think that I'm going to know the details, and maybe we never will. Probably will settle. But allegedly, he recorded them, and then he sent that recording to another e-girl that he was flirting with, and then she either released it or got hacked. I don't know. I'm not sure anyone knows. And potentially that's how that video of him with that other gentleman got released to the internet also. But in any event, a video that he recorded was released non-consensually from her perspective on the internet. And that happened. She brought the allegations publicly. I think it was like on Monday. And I did the interview with him on Saturday. And look, man, I'm a father, of 2 daughters. So those allegations don't sit well with me. Like it's the kind of thing that makes me angry. I'm also a lawyer by profession. Like I got somebody off of death row who was convicted of murder and was on death row for 40 years in Texas. Like the idea that I'm interacting with somebody who has been accused of something that I find pretty heinous is not new to me. This is something I do professionally. So I'm able to separate my disdain for the behavior and have a conversation with Destiny, and I'm not opposed to having more conversations with Destiny. But it's gross. The allegations are pretty gross. And then for me, rather than having like like you said, this conversation went really well, like 60,000 views, like maybe I can do something with this. It was every time I post on X, I'm going to get somebody following up like, do you support revenge pornography? Are you a revenge pornographer? And I'm like, oh, gee, like, so definitely a welcome to the internet moment. It can
Exactly. That's what I was thinking. And neither of us are, obviously. I'm certainly not. You're certainly not. We're not impugning Destiny's character. I made a joke about him. The video's out there. Private life is private life. If he did something wrong, then let the law come down. That's just how things go. But I don't know anything about the guy, other than he's got a big platform, and you don't get a big platform without having a lot of talent. And so that is interesting about the internet. you see different sides of people, and you really don't know the whole picture. So it's just a fascinating time to be operating.
Yeah, and I think that there's, to our previous conversation about like life on the internet, one of the things that he does well in terms of drawing eyes is he vacillates between edgy hot takes and informed discussion and debate.
Hmm.
And um, it's a successful strategy that you see a lot of people employ. Like you see it on the right too. Like you'll see like someone like Michael Knowles will give a really spicy hot take
Hmm.
and then is prepared to defend it eloquently with details later. But the hot take is still phrased as provocatively as possible
Right.
because
Right.
he's trying to draw eyes. I'm hoping that we can come up with a solution that doesn't involve clickbaity
Hmm.
this in that way, but certainly it seems to be the current king of the model. That's how
Yeah,
you
that
draw
might be the
eyes
new
to the
head.
platform.
Clickbait might be the new headline,
Yeah,
and
I
that's
mean
just how you have
that's
to
maybe
think
what
about
it
it.
is.
Yeah, and the articles down there in the comments and all of that. It's pretty interesting.
One of my favorite Destiny quotes is, if you're debating someone on the internet and you've read the Wikipedia entry on the topic, you are probably more informed than the person you are talking to.
That's
Which
interesting.
sadly is true. Like, I think a lot of people with really spicy takes have read the headline or the clickbait, and they didn't even click on the article, let alone the Wikipedia article. That's not saying Wikipedia is the gold standard. It is not. But like, they don't even have that, which is at best surface level knowledge,
Yeah.
which is a shame. But that's kind of where we are.
Yeah, no, the internet, information flow, disinformation, misinformation, censorship. I mean, it's a whole conversation unto itself.
Yeah, and I am very pro free speech. Even the idea that there would be government action on quote unquote disinformation is wild. Like that, because
Right.
how would you possibly qualify that? It's one thing to say like, we caught a Russian espionage bot farm and we're shutting that down. But to
Mhm.
say like, okay, well, this person is saying something we disagree with. Well,
Right.
no.
Right.
They get to be wrong. They can be
Right.
egregiously wrong. That if free speech doesn't defend your right to be wrong, I can't think what it possibly would defend. That you never need free speech when you're both right and popular. That's there's no one's coming after you at that point. You need free speech when you're unpopular or
Right.
wrong or spicy or doing something that someone disagrees with, right?
Yeah. No,
Otherwise,
I
go.
100% agree. And I definitely consider myself much more of a classic liberal like yourself. Just again, highlighting that it's just bizarre to operate on the internet. You have to be prepared. The individual, the onus, because of that freedom and responsibility structure, the onus is on each of us to be prepared to navigate what is a
Yeah.
tricky place.
Also, it's so weird. Just the idea that we would both self-identify if asked as classic liberals, and neither of us was willing to vote for the Democratic Party, which
Hmm.
was the
Right.
party until very recently. If you ask me which party was better at classically liberal values, it would obviously be the Democrats. Like, I grew up in the 90s, early 2000s, where it's like, okay, which party was trying to
Mm.
censor Eminem's music? It was the right. Like, the right was the dominant institutional party that was trying to impose its values on society, and the left was the kind of like resurgent counterculture, individual rights. And what you've seen
Right.
is this shift where the left dominated traditional institutions in
Yes.
academia, and I would say also in kind of the government bureaucracy, where it's just easier to establish democratic footholds. And over time, the culture, and now there's been this kind of like smashing of the institutions, the right resurgence in this new online counterculture space that's kind of becoming the new mainstream. And they switch
Hmm.
sides, and I expect they'll switch sides again later. And that's what's
Hmm.
weird for someone who really is classically liberal, is that you're always going to be on the side that's championing the values. But the teams, as I get older, I realize switch. They're not
Mm.
necessarily going to stay the same. Like, they're going to do what's politically expedient for them. And our job, if we want to police these values is to hold them to account and say, no, you have my vote so long as you're the party that's better about this stuff. The second you switch over and become the party that's trying to cram things down on people, we're out. And maybe, just maybe, we can get a party that's fully on board with that down the road. We'll
Right.
see.
Wow. Well, I think right there you've just solved my problem. This is why I host people. And I try to host people with of such as quality such as yourself. This has been amazing. But that might be the answer right there. Searching for political identity. Hey, man, you're a classic liberal. The pendulum's going to swing. So be prepared and hold them to account. I love that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't agree with him on everything, but one of the things that Bill Maher caught endless shit for was that he was constantly criticizing the Biden administration. And, I think that people who are more into political outcomes would say, hey, Bill, you're a Democrat. You're going to vote left no matter what. Why are you spending so much time criticizing the left? Doesn't that just help the right? And maybe it does, but that's not his interest. And this is what I give him credit for. His interest is in defending values that he believes in regardless of the party. So when the left goes way off the reservation and starts promoting group identity instead of individual rights and starts pushing for the losing side of 80-20 issues, like, I mean, do we think people who are born male should be allowed to go into combat sports with women? Like, these are not complicated questions. These are easy questions. And if your party's losing its way and no one holds them to account, they're going to just keep going further and further and further. So, I mean, I'm hoping that both sides will have this, where it's like, you need to keep your eye on the ball and hold your leadership to account, because they're going to want to win. They're going to try to do whatever is politically useful. And it's your job to tell them, if you go in this direction, you're losing my support. It's not politically useful. Like, you might think it is, but you're wrong. And here's the votes you're going to lose.
Interesting. Makes perfect sense. I want to ask you about the death penalty. We brought that up somehow. I'm in favor of it.
Yeah.
That's my gut reaction. Where do you stand?
I think in the abstract, I am too. I don't think anyone would be in favor of the death penalty we currently have. So, like, the client that I worked for example, he was arrested for I'm losing the track of the exact year, but it was in the late 70s, early 80s. And he was on death row in Texas for 40 years. That doesn't make any sense. Like, there's no way that you could think, even if you're very pro death penalty, that having someone, because death row, by the way, is a very unpleasant place. Like, this is not.
You don't say.
Yeah. So to have a man spend 40 years on death row, and there's parts of his case, he was, I mean, it's really a crazy fact pattern. It turned out that the detective who arrested him, he's a Mexican national. So he was arrested in Texas for the murder of a cab driver named Castañon. But the detective who arrested him worked with a detective in Juarez. And the detective in Juarez took his mother and father into custody and then they called it into the US, got on the phone. He was informed that if he didn't confess, then his family would be tortured in Juarez. Then he confessed to the murders. And the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals said, well, despite the fact that this has all been proven to be true, we think the conviction is still good because there was other evidence. So, and I mean, so it was really a really terrible story, but I don't think that works. Like, in a perfect world, I don't think I'm opposed to the death penalty for certain types of crimes. I do think we have to figure out a way to make it a functional system, because if you're going to have somebody incarcerated for 40 years, that doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make sense fiscally. It doesn't make it. It's basically cruel and unusual punishment in my mind. Like, if you're going to do it, do it. And part of that is, lawyers like you and me are part of the problem. Like, the appeals process does take forever. So on one hand, I think there needs to be a solution, but I don't quite know what it is. Because if you look at my client, he was on death row for 40 years. We have this crazy appeals process that's gumming up the works, and we're constantly in there. But then we won. So now he's a free man, and he's living his life in Mexico. So,
Wow.
sometimes the juice is worth the squeeze.
Mm.
So I don't think I have a clever solution to that. I'm
Yeah.
not sure that might be a non-answer, but that's
No,
kind
no,
of
I'm sure I'll change my mind on the issue, and I don't really have, detailed thoughts on it, but just conceptually, I don't know why. Maybe it's just me being a tough guy. It probably is, you know.
um I mean, I think in some senses, all right, on like first principles, if you look at crime, it is the majority of crime is committed by a very small number of repeat offenders.
Mm.
And they tend to be male, and they tend to just repeat until they turn 50. When you get old enough, that's the thing that kind of cuts the
That's
testosterone, and
fascinating.
then people stop committing crimes. So whether they're incarcerated or executed,
Hmm.
just getting that population, it's a small group of people off of the street, is really the number one determiner of how much crime you have, because it's just constant repeat by the same people. So in that sense, that's a great argument for the death penalty, especially if it's a really violent offender. The flip side of that is that you can't unring that bell. You just, and you're going to be wrong from time to time. Like they were wrong with my client, and that's a crazy thing to be wrong about. When you execute somebody and now you can apologize to their family and they can win a lawsuit against you, but I guess you can't get the years back from incarceration either, but at least there's some remedy. Here, there's
Yeah.
really none.
Right.
So it's a thorny problem. It should be reserved for the most egregious crimes and the most egregious situations. But I do think those situations exist.
So I want to ask you a question about the Supreme Court. I
Mhm.
don't know if it's a good question. Is there someone who's the most important person on that court?
To me, right now, I think you're going to see Thomas is kind of the ideological pillar of the right in some sense. He's the most originalist. He's the most consistent unitary executive theorist. So he's going to be he and Alito are going to be championing the court in that direction. I think the people to watch are um, Chief Justice Roberts, Justice Barrett, and Justice Kavanaugh, because they're very different, but their judicial philosophies are, I wouldn't call them more flexible, but they're more in play. Like you'll see them vote with the liberal minority more often than you'll see someone like an Alito or a Thomas do it.
Is it
So
for
if you're writing a
activist
brief,
reasons? Do they do it for activist reasons, or is it a result of just their judicial approach, do you think?
I think they do have different approaches. Like if you looked at Justice Barrett's decision on Trump's immunity, she's right. Like she concurred. She didn't dissent. She concurred with the judgment, but her approach to the issue, like the analysis that she provided and the legal framework that she said would have been better, was better.
Mhm.
Like if that was the majority opinion, it would be a better opinion. That doesn't mean I defend the majority opinion in the immunity case, so I think it was still better than the dissent's approach. But her concurrence was really, really good. And I think that what you're seeing, one of the splits that you'll see in terms of philosophy, is that Justices Alito and Thomas are unitary executive theorists. Gorsuch, I think, too, but I'm not as familiar, so I don't want to say that. Meaning that if there's a question about does the president have power to do something, they're going to almost always answer yes, unless it's clearly reserved for another branch. Whereas someone like Roberts or Kavanaugh or Justice Barrett are not necessarily unitary executive theorists. So they're going to look more searchingly at the Constitution, at the way what the legislature did, and what the delegation of authority was, and it's their answer is going to depend on the facts a little bit more than someone like
Mhm.
Thomas's will.
Mhm.
And I think if I was litigating one of these cases right now, and there's going to be a lot of them with Doge, all these lawsuits going to the Supreme Court,
Mhm.
you're really writing for those three justices because
Mm.
Thomas and Alito are going to do what they're going to do. Jackson, Kagan, Sotomayor are going to do what they're going to do. But those three justices are going to decide who wins and loses because their votes are up in the air. So I think really savvy lawyers are going to be reading their decisions really carefully,
Mhm.
reading their concurrences really carefully, their dissents, and pitching their briefs to those specific ears. And that's going to determine how a lot of these cases turn out.
Mm. Amazing. This has been an amazing conversation, Ryan. I really appreciate it. Let me ask you one final question. What are you working on, if not professionally, then maybe in terms of your passion, your advocacy? What are you up to?
Sure. So yeah, I would be delighted if anyone who watches this would follow me on X. I think my information's on the screen and below. And my current pet projects, and because I'm speaking for myself, I don't want to talk about firm or client work because I'm not representing those interests when I do something like this. My pet projects are speaking and writing on X to try to explain legal issues in a way that is
Mm.
fair and will help people navigate these waters, maybe make originalism a little bit less of a boogeyman. And then the other project that's kind of just a passion project is looking into American deism, which is, like everyone talks about the Christian founding of America, which is
Mhm.
mostly accurate. Our founders were mostly Christian, but there was also a smattering of deists, which mean that they believe in God, they believe in natural law, but they don't necessarily accept the Bible or claims of revelation. And that's really fascinating because I think the dialogue between the deists and the Christians really informed our country's approach to federalism and our
Mm.
constitution, and certainly religious freedom. Because if they disagreed on such weighty topics even back then, that it kind of explains why religious freedom was so important to them.
Mm.
So if you're interested in religious philosophy and how that impacts law, I do quite a bit of that as well.
Oh my God, absolutely. We have to have another conversation about that if you're willing to come
Yeah.
back.
Well, are you keeping the podcast going? I saw your tweet the other
I'm
day. I was
such a
like,
drama queen.
oh
I'm such a drama queen. I probably will. I just gotta, you know, make sure I don't spend too much time on it. I'm leveling up at work. I'm getting married. I gotta maintain a social life. So we'll see.
no. I feel you. This is one of the challenges of working in law is that there are never enough. You could never work too much. Like
Mm.
lawyer, like it's
Right.
just this the nature of the industry.
Right.
So any time you spend not working almost has to be justified in some way
Yeah.
because you could always be working. Which sounds dramatic. If you're not in law, I'm just going to let you know it is not. Like that is
No,
the
I'm not.
nature of the industry is that you bill by the hour. Your career will be better off if you work more hours. There's no way around that.
Well, the other thing I got to figure out is like, have I run out of passion? I mean, I was really, this podcast, I kind of answered my question in a way. I mean, I didn't totally answer. I've never, I didn't find my political identity, but I pretty much, and this conversation is really helpful. Classic liberal. I get a little magatized at the end.
Yeah.
Okay, fine. But, this is where I landed. But I like what you're doing with the objective legal analysis and communicating. That is something, see, that makes sense. So, keep doing what you're doing. It's really good. It's really important, and you're doing a great job.
Hey, I appreciate that, Brian. And for my 2 cents, and obviously, you got to weigh your work-life balance and your career, and that's for you to decide. But I think the journey you went on, especially because you did go all the way and now would identify as MAGA, is interesting. And I think it's going to be important because President Trump, for all his virtues, is more of a sledgehammer than a scalpel.
Hmm.
And it is very likely that he's going to tear down a bunch of stuff that deserves to be torn down. And from time to time, he's going to hit a structural pillar that maybe
Hmm.
shouldn't be hit.
Hmm.
And having people who have credibility within the right
Hmm.
to be able to say, like, no, look, I voted for this guy. I'm supportive of his
Right.
mission. I want these things to work, and
Right.
still, let's not do this.
Right.
That's I think as important as anything else, because I don't think our system works with unchecked political power. I think
Yeah.
that having
Right.
people who have a platform, have a voice, and are sensitive to those things is really valuable.
Well, I appreciate that. It makes a lot of sense, and that would be a great thing, a role to play. I just got to make sure that I maintain my openness to objectivity. I mean, I've gotten a little politicized here. So let me. One, I guess the final question is this: should any alarm bells have been going off in my head already? I'm a new Trump supporter. Okay, didn't really.
Um,
Yeah, tell me.
I watched the free speech stuff really carefully. I don't I don't think
Mhm.
President Trump is a big believer in constitutional norms. I think that he is an expedient remedy to violations that were happening. Like, he's going to tear
Mhm.
down a system that was doing things it shouldn't have done, and in that sense is great. But I don't think he's the kind of guy who's going to say, "Oh, I want to deport Khalil. Let me check whether that's a free speech violation." I don't
Right.
think that's how he works. I think he's going to say, "I want to deport this guy. Let's make it happen,
Right.
and let the lawyers figure it out later."
Right.
So I would watch carefully the free speech stuff,
Right. Yep.
and then I would watch carefully the trade stuff as well. Like, I don't I'm not such a naysayer that I'm gonna say that we shouldn't do any of this stuff, but he's shaking things up. That could be
Yeah.
good, but I
Right.
want to see where it lands. Let's hold him accountable to that. Like, if you're gonna introduce tariffs that are gonna destabilize our economy, okay, well, let that's the squeeze. Let's look for the juice.
Right.
And if it turns out like, oh my God, we revitalized the American manufacturing base,
Right.
then congratulations, you're a genius. You pulled it off. On the
Right.
flip side, if that doesn't happen, and we just tanked our retirement portfolios for nothing, then we need to say something about that. So yeah, I think that we can be fair and supportive, and same with Doge, by the way. Like, I I am so delighted that any political party cares about reducing the scope of the federal government. Like, no one's cared about this in a
Right.
long time. So great. All aboard. I hope it works. That said, it has to actually work at the end of the day, right? So
Mhm.
if Doge spins up a bunch of lawsuits, loses a bunch of lawsuits, cuts a little bit of money, but doesn't really accomplish its goals, then we wasted an opportunity. So I think we want to watch this stuff carefully and make sure that they're actually succeeding,
Right.
because for those of us who want these things to change, there's just always the risk that they step on a rake, and they end up getting into a losing legal fight or a losing political fight, and then the chance for real change is gone.
Yep. And the pattern the last so many years has been the left, in my opinion, makes in the media makes all these overreactions to Trump, and they paint him, unfairly. And so there's these disruptions now that maybe we weren't promised, but they're happening. And so, where's that line between, well, it's too early to tell. It's probably too early to tell. So
Mhm.
I got to give it a little more time, I think is what I'm hearing. But, don't go too far, don't go too long without doing an honest reevaluation. But you got to give him some time. But on the other
Yeah.
hand, to his critics' point, he didn't promise these disruptions. So it's he's shaking it up. He's
Well,
shaking
and
it
you,
up.
you raise a really good point, which is what makes this so hard. It just takes a lot of effort and work, because
Hmm.
it is 100% true that the left will overreact to everything he does. So anything he does is going to get this insane negative reaction, right? And that makes it very hard to tell when he's doing something that's good, something that's neutral, or
Right.
something that's bad, because it's going to get the same reaction every time. So if you're trying to be fair, then you have to independently evaluate everything. And I do think that that's a problem. Like, one thing
Right.
that I hope the left does, for their own sake and for all of our sakes, is that they start getting a little bit more honest about this, where they say, like,
Mm,
we're going to reserve our outrage for the truly horrible thing. When
right.
he's doing something that's just something Republicans like and we don't like, okay, we don't like it. We would have done it differently, but it's
Hmm.
within the bounds of what political parties do. So we're going to moderate our reaction.
Yes.
I told Destiny this recently. Like, I think it's a huge mistake for the Democrats to lean into the politics of outrage. I don't think the left can win, pardon my language, a who's the bigger asshole contest with Donald Trump. I think if you're getting into a meme war, if you're getting into who gets to own each other harder, he's going to win that 100% of the time. It's his superpower. Right. So if for the left to be functional, they have to be the grown-ups in the room. And then they'll put some pressure on the right to respond. But if they devolve into chaos and memes and internet outrage, like I think that is, I could not imagine a more favorable political battlefield for him. I don't think there's a human being in the history of God's green earth who could beat him in a meme contest. No. It is literally what he does.
Yeah, they're playing the wrong game. They play the wrong game. And whether it's the outrage game or the meme game or the TikTok dancing, where it's like, I mean, cool, like I'm happy you guys are having fun and dancing, like you're creative and talented, but come on, like this is not, really?
Yeah, and I think part of that is, sorry, we're going to do like the spicy hot takes at the end. I think part of that is just their inability to recognize when they put up a weak candidate. Because when Hillary ran, they're like, oh, remember she said, when they go low, we go high. And it didn't resonate. And they're like, oh, so maybe we need to change our approach. What they're leaving out is that she was a historically weak candidate who people didn't like. Mm-hmm. And then Harris tried to take a more moderate approach, but nobody believed her because she's never been a moderate. And, nobody believed her because she was obviously an institutional creature. The flip side is when Biden ran and they ran on being the adults in the room, they won. Right. It is a workable message for the Democrats to run as the party that has a common sense plan to get things done. Right. But they have to put up a candidate who can credibly sell that message. And when they do fine. Right. They didn't lose in 2016 or 2024 because of the message in that sense. They lost because the candidates were bad. They need new blood. They need real candidates who can go up there and credibly say that they have a actionable plan to make life better, and here's how. And if they do that, they'll do fine. But
absolutely.
If they do that and they abandon these 80-20 issues where they're saying it's okay to be racist if you're fighting racism, it's okay to be sexist if you're fighting sexism. They need to get out of that.
You are racist if you're not fighting racism.
Yeah, exactly. Like those, the culture war's been won. Those are losing issues. You cannot run on those anymore. It's done. And I think you see the savvy Democrats are doing that, like Buttigieg and Newsom. They're all running away from this stuff as fast as they can because they've read the room. It's losing. You can't run on that in 2028. So hopefully, that's a message received and the Democratic Party is competitive. Or maybe they just self-destruct. They do the same shit they did last time, and it'll take another election cycle before they learn the lesson. We'll see.
Yeah. That's amazing. Yeah, that's what they need to do. They need to concede defeat on the culture war and put up a competent candidate. I mean, my goodness, that would go a long way. And it'll be interesting to see what a guy like I does in that situation. I mean, I think, if I was, able to get around to voting for Trump, what would I do if it's JD Vance? I mean, look, there's a lot of talent on the Republican side. That bench is pretty deep.
Oof, they got to. I've been trying to warn my Democrat friends about this because a lot of them are like, they kind of fell into this trap during the election where they said like JD Vance is weird, JD Vance is kind of creepy, no one's going to vote for him. And I was like, I think you guys were looking at everything through a political lens, not an objective lens. JD Vance was by far the most effective communicator in the last election cycle. He crushed it. And he's navigating being vice president to Trump extraordinarily well, which, by the way, is one of the hardest vice president jobs you could possibly have. That's a very easy boss to lose favor with. Right. And he's navigating it extraordinarily well. I think he's a political monster. I think you're going to have to put up extraordinary political talent to beat him in 2028. Right. And I have not seen that from the left yet. Right. So, I'm actually rooting for them in that sense. I think a competitive process leads to the best outcomes. Right. Right now, it looks like a wipeout in 2028. So maybe they'll. I'm hopeful that they'll figure it out.
And that's a not so small factor in why so many people, I think, like myself, have been shifting. All these factors that I talked about and we've talked about, but also the lack of a competitive process internally to the party. It's just like you put all of that together, and here we are. So they need to fix their internal system.
Oh my. Okay, yeah. Sorry, I'm going to get on a soapbox because this is a pet issue of mine. Like some of my friends have asked me, like, how could you possibly have ruled out Harris before ruling out Trump?
Mm.
And the lion's share of my answer is that if I look at the process that led to Harris's nomination, and I'm going to go back pretty far, you saw Bernie lose to Hillary, and he lost because the establishment squeezed him out. We all watched it happen.
Yep.
I was not a Bernie fan, so I was okay with that.
Hmm.
But in retrospect, that was hugely damaging to the Democratic Party because they showed that the establishment within the DNC has the power to control these outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
Then you have Biden, who clearly deteriorated during his time in office, and I don't think any sane person could look at that and say he was running the country the last couple months, maybe the last couple of years.
Right.
But everyone lied about it. So we know who's running it. It's the Democratic establishment. Then he finally drops out after the most disastrous debate performance of all time, showing that he's in no way capable of doing this job. Whatever his qualities might have been previous to that, they're no longer evident. And we, without a primary, swap in Harris. And then she abandons every political view she'd ever espoused and now has a totally different platform.
Right. Voila.
Yeah. And so what she's running as in light of that history is, I am the bureaucratic candidate. I am running not as a president or an individual with views. I am running as, do you want the DNC to run the presidency through bureaucracy the way they did the last couple of years in the Biden administration? And that's wild. Like that's for me, like there's no way I could vote for that. And I don't think anyone who really thought about it should vote for that. So, I mean, she was ruled out almost instantly once I got a sense of what was happening. And they can't do that. They need to put up a vibrant potential executive with real views, with real values that we understand. And we understand that when they get elected, they're going to enact those values. And then maybe they have a chance. But if they're trying to run the president by committee, I don't think anybody, I can't imagine that there's a majority of the American population that loves bureaucracy so much that they would vote to establish a president by committee. It's just crazy.
Yeah. No, amazing job highlighting just how, I keep using this word, bizarre of a time this is. We need to get back to more competition. We'll see what happens. But you can understand why someone like myself would be going on a search for political identity. You know, the law school, everything A to Z. It's just like, oof.
Yeah, I mean, look, it doesn't have to even be that complicated. Like, I think if you go to law school and you're the kind of person who says, like, no, actually, I believe racism is wrong. Not because I think it's fundamentally wrong, meaning that I think it's wrong all the time. And I think it's a constitutional guidepost, meaning we don't get to do it to fix a problem. Just like I don't get to infringe on your speech to fix a problem. I don't get to take away your Second Amendment rights to fix a problem. I don't get to be racist to fix a problem because I actually believe in the constitutional value. Does that mean I can't fix the problem? No, but it means I have to go at it in another way. And that's what the Democrats used to do. They used to say, you used to have things like, well, okay, we're not going to be racist to solve racism, but what we could do is increase the quality of education in communities that are underserved. Will that have a disproportionate effect on Black families? Yes, it will disproportionately benefit Black families to do that because there is a disparity in wealth and in educational achievement in society, and that is worth trying to fix. You just can't be racist to do it, right? Like, use the zip code, use the income level, just don't be racist. And I think the left used to accept these guideposts, and as a result, they did come across as the party that was defending individual liberty. And the reason CRT, I think, was so offensive to those who understood it, like you, is that it was a total abandonment of that. They were saying, no. If there's a guidepost that's in the way of fixing this problem, CRT expressly says we should tear it down. If we should tear down the fabric of society to address these wrongs. That is the platform, and that is not acceptable. Like it deserves to be drummed out of public life, not
Mm,
by censorship, but because it's a bad idea. And if you expose it to public scrutiny, it's indefensible. And
right.
I think you're seeing that. Like Ibram X. Kendi, kind of like the godfather of
Right.
CRT is not CRT, but like of pushing anti-racism into American culture, has been drummed out of his university. He's now had a scandal back at another university where it's not going particularly well because his ideas are bad. And
Mm,
when he's exposed to a intellectual heavyweight who understands them, he can't defend them because he's not an intellectual heavyweight. His ideas are bad, and we deserve good ideas.
yeah, absolutely. Yep. Well, this has been really good. And now I'm like, okay, what's next, Brian? Am I going to keep podcasting? Which am I going to try to be this influencer? Am I going to try to be this objective voice? Am I just going to shut the hell up and go to work? I got to figure it out. But this has given me a lot to reflect on.
Hey, well,
Really grateful.
Godspeed, Brian. This was a lot of fun. Glad to do it, and
Yep.
obviously, up to you to figure it out. But I am supportive of somebody with your background having a public role. I think it's worth doing.
I appreciate it. Well, if I don't shut it down, then I would absolutely love to have you back.
Hey, anytime.
Appreciate it, man. Have a great day.
You too. Bye.
Later.